If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I worked as a security guard at a small warehouse in my city. It seemed like a simple job at first glance, but it paid better than I expected. The job wasn't ideal, especially since I worked the night shift, but the good pay made up for the long hours. The company I worked for sold expensive tech items, which made 24/7 surveillance necessary. That night, heavy rain was pouring, and thunder occasionally echoed in the dark sky. The atmosphere was a bit eerie, but it gave me a sense of comfort, as it was unlikely that anyone would go out in such weather. I arrived at work at 10:30 p.m. and had a brief chat with the shift workers who were preparing to leave, leaving the warehouse in my care until 6 a.m. The place was usually quiet, but the sound of the rain hitting the metal roof made it almost impossible to hear anything else. 2 hours into my shift, I felt the need to move. I got up to walk around the building for a routine security check. I went to the back of the warehouse, where most of the storage was located, and then began walking towards the front. Suddenly, a faint beeping sound echoed through the hallway. It was an alert coming from the security room. I rushed to check it out. It turned out to be a latch sensor on the back door, indicating that someone had tried to open it. I pulled up the live camera feed covering the door, but there was no one there. Feeling a bit uneasy, I decided to check the door myself. Maybe the sensors were malfunctioning due to the rain. I disabled the alarm and cautiously opened the door, only to find a dark, empty alleyway behind the warehouse. Everything seemed normal. The door itself looked fine, and I wasn't an expert, but I ran a test, and the sensor was working properly. I looked around once more before shutting and locking the door. Although I saw nothing suspicious, I still had to file a full report due to the alarm being triggered. So, I returned to the security office and began filling out the paperwork. Only a couple of minutes later, a loud thud echoed throughout the entire building. I froze in place, staring down the hallway, unsure where the noise came from. I left the room and stood in the corridor, listening for any other sounds, but all I could hear was the rain hammering on the roof. Cautiously, I began walking through the building, scanning the shelves for fallen boxes or any visible damage. As I approached the front of the building, the sound of the rain grew louder. Turning the corner, I came to a sudden stop. The front door was wide open. On the floor, I saw the reflection of small water puddles, indicating that someone had entered the building. Fear surged through me. I sprinted back to the security office and locked myself inside, pressing the emergency button to call the police. As I waited, I heard a few more thuds from somewhere in the building, but then it went quiet until the police arrived. When they got there, I waited by the entrance and gave my report to one of the officers, while 2 others searched the warehouse. A minute later, they returned with a man in handcuffs. They said he had been hiding behind some boxes in the storage area, holding a hammer. As he passed by me, he shot me a cold, piercing stare that sent a shiver down my spine. A few days later, the police informed me that the man had been under the influence of several drugs and had given no explanation for his actions. It wasn't clear what his intentions were, but he had forcefully broken in and was hiding with a hammer. In his intoxicated state, There's no telling what he might have done. Thankfully, he's still behind bars, and I no longer work night shifts at that creepy warehouse. But that night still lingers in my memory, especially on rainy nights when I can't see or hear what's around me. It was a quiet and mysterious night as I began my night shift as an officer in the local police department. The shifts in our department constantly changed, and we were used to working long hours, sometimes ranging from 10 to 12 hours, fluctuating between night and day shifts. This kind of schedule could be exhausting at times, but over the years I had adapted to it. That night, my shift started at 10 p.m. and stretched until 10 a.m. I was sitting in my office, reviewing some routine reports, when a call came in from dispatch. It was about a group of teenagers trespassing on private property. The location? An abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. That place had been closed for over a decade, but over the years it had become a hot spot for teenagers looking for adventure or a remote spot to engage in illegal activities. This wasn't the first time we had received such a call. In fact, it was the fourth time I had been called to that very location myself. Each time, it was pretty much the same, either escorting the teenagers out quietly or watching them scatter as soon as they spotted me. Honestly, I wasn't too concerned about arresting them or pressing charges. I just wanted them off the property so I could return to my long shift and finish the night in peace. As I arrived at the scene, the air was thick with the scent of dust and dampness, the kind that only old, abandoned buildings seem to give off. It didn't take long for me to notice that something was off. On the second floor of the hospital, I saw the beam of a flashlight moving quickly across several windows, as if someone was running down the hallway. The speed and erratic movement of the light were strange, almost unnatural. I stepped out of my car, flashlight in hand, and approached the main entrance of the hospital. The old door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing eerily through the empty halls. I called out, announcing my presence and ordering anyone inside to show themselves. But as expected, no one responded. For a moment I stood still at the entrance, listening for any sounds that might give away their location. But there was only silence. A silence so deep that it jolted me awake, making my nerves tingle. My right hand instinctively rested on the holster of my gun. There was always a slight fear that this could be some kind of trap, designed to lure an officer inside. But I remained calm, collected my thoughts, and began walking down the narrow, decaying hallway. Each step I took echoed softly in the abandoned space. I made my way up the stairs, which groaned under my weight, each creak adding to the tension that was building inside me. Just as I reached the second floor, a loud thud resonated through the building. It sounded like someone had hit the wall, and it was definitely coming from the second floor. I raised my flashlight, casting its beam down the long corridor ahead, but there was no one there, no sign of anyone at all. I called out once more, this time more aggressively, my voice firm as I reminded myself that the stairs I had just climbed were the only way up or down from this floor. Still, there was no response, only the faint creaks of the old building. I walked cautiously through the hallway, opening each door I came across, scanning the rooms with my flashlight. But each room was the same, old hospital beds, graffiti, and nothing more. When I reached the last room at the end of the hall, I noticed the door was closed. My pulse quickened. I called out again before opening the door. The room was empty, but there were clear signs that someone had been there recently. Cigarette butts littered the floor and smoke was still rising from them. This was troubling. Whoever was here hadn't left through the stairs, and the only other way out was through a broken window. Before I could investigate further, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that made my heart race. I heard something heavy being pushed against it, followed by hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway. Thankfully, I managed to force the door open, only to find that a large hospital bed had been pushed against it from the outside. By the time I got out, whoever had been there was long gone. Backup arrived shortly after, and we conducted a more thorough investigation. We even checked in with the person who had made the original call, the two teenagers. But the strange thing was that I had only heard one set of footsteps, and I had only seen one flashlight in the window. The cigarettes, still burning, suggested they had left in a hurry, perhaps because of my arrival. But why would one of them stay behind? The next morning, we received reports from two mothers about their missing teenage sons. After days, then weeks, and finally months of searching, it became almost certain that they weren't coming back. And now, 6 years later, they still haven't been found. Their disappearance remains a mystery, and that's what makes it so difficult. We still don't know if the person I encountered in the hospital that night was one of the missing boys or someone else entirely. The most stable theory we have is that it was someone else. But unless more evidence comes to light, we may never know for sure. It was a cold night as I stood in the parking lot of the gas station where I worked. The sky was overcast and snow was falling heavily, making the scene look like a winter painting. I was on the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I had been at this job for several months. Although I didn't really like this job, finding another one was a huge challenge. Night shifts worked best for my personal schedule, even though I went to work exhausted every night and struggled to get through each shift. I parked in front of the building next to the only other car in the lot, which belonged Grace. As I sat behind the desk, the clock struck midnight. I glanced outside and noticed an old SUV parked by on. After so long, I stood up and moved closer to the window to check both sides of the building. I paid more attention for the next few minutes, waiting to see any movement through the dark windows or for someone to get back inside their car, but there was nothing. It was as if the car had been abandoned right next to the pump. After some thought, I put on my jacket and stepped outside immediately. I knew I was right. It was far too cold for anyone to be inside with the engine off, or for someone to even be outside for more than a few minutes. I rushed over to the car and looked around, then put my face close to the window and tried to look inside. Hello? Anyone in there? Just checking to see if you're okay, I called out. But from what I could see, there wasn't anyone inside. It wasn't exactly easy to see, so someone could have been in there. But I was pretty sure there wasn't. Now, even more confused, I backed up and looked around at the empty gas station parking lot before starting to walk back. As my eyes were not focused on the car, I noticed shoe prints in the snow leading toward the building, not directly in front, but a little off to the side. I looked back and saw that they seemed to come from the car. But at this point, I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without warming up a bit first. I went inside and turned on the small heater next to the counter, putting my hands in front of it to warm them up. I was only inside for 30 seconds to a minute, though, before a thump resonated through the building from behind me. I spun around but didn't see anything, then walked around the counter toward the back. On the floor, there were puddles of dirty water, like snow that had melted off someone's boots. Feeling a chill run through me, I stepped closer to the back room and turned the corner toward where the supply room was. Standing in the dark behind one of the shelves, I could see the outline of a figure. They were tall with broad shoulders and had a large, scruffy beard, and they were looking right at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to just walk back to the counter. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too shocked to react appropriately. After staring at the doorway to the supply room for claws, I don't even know how long, I quietly picked up the store phone and called the police, whispering for help. I then endured the most unnerving 10 minutes of my life as I waited. During this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room, which honestly added to my fear. For some reason, the man never came out to confront me. When 2 cops finally pulled in and came inside, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed by the front, but I was shocked when they came out with nobody else. The man was gone. Watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, but outside were fresh tracks in the snow leading straight away from the gas station into the completely dark, empty field that stretched on for miles. Obviously, nobody could search that at night, but even when they did in the following days, they didn't find anything. I mean, the field was huge. He could have gone anywhere, but it was so cold and windy that night that I was almost sure they'd find a body. The SUV was taken in for hopefully more information. I don't know how or why, but for some reason, they couldn't find any history of ownership. So that left us with just what we knew from that night, and we were still left with just that. Who the man was and what he was doing remains unsolved, and where he is now is just as much of a question. This year, I started my first job as a delivery driver for Pizza Hut. I'm 16, so this was only a part-time job that I worked after school a couple of days a week. I chose Pizza Hut because it's not that busy nowadays, and I didn't want to have a job that stressed me out all the time. The first few months passed with nothing of interest. It was a very boring and repetitive job that left most days forgettable. But then I had one experience that I'll never forget. It was a Friday, and just before closing, we received an order for delivery. The address wasn't too far, but it took me through a part of town I almost never visited. This neighborhood was different from the rest, lacking many houses or stores, which gave me no reason to go there. As I drove through, I kept checking the GPS as it led me down seemingly every road until it finally indicated that I had arrived. However, something felt off. On my left, there was a row of maybe 6 or 7 houses, and on my right was a path leading to a park. The waypoint on the GPS was showing up on the right side, so I double-checked by searching the address on Google, confirming it was indeed the park's address. I parked on the side of the road and picked up the pizza. Walking up the path for a better look, I noticed it was just a walking path and didn't lead to any playground or anything. I had expected to see a group of kids who had ordered the pizza, but instead, there was a guy sitting on a bench a little ways down, waving at me. I started walking over, still a bit unsure. As I got closer, he stood up and began sifting through his wallet for cash. The fact that he was alone on a walking path at night and needed a pizza delivered there was odd, to say the least. So I was skeptical as I approached him. This year, I started my first job as a delivery driver for Pizza Hut. I'm 16, so this was only a part-time job that I worked after school a couple of days a week. I chose Pizza Hut because it's not that busy nowadays, and I didn't want to have a job that stressed me out all the time. The first few months passed with nothing of interest. It was a very boring and repetitive job that left most days forgettable. But then I had one experience that I'll never forget. It was a Friday, and just before closing, we received an order for delivery. The address wasn't too far, but it took me through a part of town I almost never visited. This neighborhood was different from the rest, lacking many houses or stores, which gave me no reason to go there. As I drove through, I kept checking the GPS as it led me down seemingly every road until it finally indicated that I had arrived. However, something felt off. On my left, there was a row of maybe 6 or 7 houses, and on my right was a path leading to a park. The waypoint on the GPS was showing up on the right side, so I double-checked by searching the address on Google, confirming it was indeed the park's address. I parked on the side of the road and picked up the pizza. Walking up the path for a better look, I noticed it was just a walking path and didn't lead to any playground or anything. I had expected to see a group of kids who had ordered the pizza, but instead, there was a guy sitting on a bench a little ways down, waving at me. I started walking over, still a bit unsure. As I got closer, he stood up and began sifting through his wallet for cash. The fact that he was alone on a walking path at night and needed a pizza delivered there was odd, to say the least. So I was skeptical as I approached him. On a cold winter night, the clock read 2 a.m. as I drove my car down a dark, empty side road, carrying the last pizza delivery of the night. I live in a small town and work at a local pizza shop. That's one of the few places offering delivery. This side road was rarely used, but it conveniently connected one side of the town to the other, without any stoplights or intersections, cutting through the thick forest surrounding us. As I drove, I began to feel something strange. I glanced at the dashboard and saw that the gas gauge was at half, and there were no warning lights indicating a problem. I shrugged it off, thinking everything was fine. However, the farther I went down the road, the more my car began to struggle. It started to shake, as if it were fighting to maintain speed, until it finally stopped accelerating altogether. I maneuvered the car to the side of the road, where it came to a halt in the grass. Feeling a bit annoyed, I looked at the dashboard again while attempting to restart the car, but had no luck. Frustrated, I rubbed my eyes and got out to inspect the car for any visible damage. I didn't notice anything, but the vehicle was old. And honestly, I didn't know what I was looking for. While I was outside, I looked down the road but saw only fog and trees. When I turned back to look in the direction I came from, I spotted a figure standing in the fog on the opposite side of the road. A sense of unease washed over me, so I quickly got back into my car and called one of my coworkers, who was also a friend, asking if he could pick me up. He agreed, but said it would be about 30 minutes. I thanked him and then called the customer to inform them of my situation and apologize for the delay. The customer was understanding, so all I could do was wait. As I sat there, I remembered the figure I had seen earlier, so I checked my mirrors but found nothing. There was no one on the side of the road or among the trees, although the darkness and fog were thick. I settled back in and opened the pizza box, grabbing a slice to pass the time. As the minutes ticked by, an eerie feeling began to creep in. Being alone on this empty road with such limited visibility started to freak me out. I could see only a few feet into the woods before darkness swallowed everything. The fog seemed to grow denser with each passing moment. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting around and checking the mirrors constantly. Suddenly, I heard something, footsteps growing louder as they approached from the dark forest. I focused on the fog and saw a man emerge near one of the trees. He walked directly up to my car, knocking on the window with a friendly smile. Sorry, I can't roll the window down," I said through the glass, feeling uncertain about the situation. The man didn't respond but casually tried to open the door before walking around to the back of the car. I glanced in the mirror and saw him standing by the trunk, seemingly trying to hide something in his hands. Just then, headlights pierced through the fog, approaching from down the road. The man watched as the car slowed down and started to pull in behind me. Then he darted into the forest, disappearing into the fog. My friend who was driving seemed to notice the man as well, because he approached my car with extreme caution. We decided to leave my car behind. On the ride back, my friend told me that the man had been holding a gun before he ran off into the woods. We called the police and had a tow truck pick up my car, which turned out to have been broken into and looted. It turned out that the gas gauge was stuck in the middle, and I had actually been driving on an empty tank. As for that man, there has been no information about him. I can't help but wonder what his intentions were. Clearly, he had robbed the car, but what would he have done to me if he had tried something while I was inside? Why was he out there on that empty road in the middle of the night anyway? All I can say is that if my friend hadn't shown up when he did, I'm pretty sure I would have never been seen again. It was around 2 a.m., and the stillness enveloped the small town where I lived. I was preparing to make my last delivery of the night, hoping to return home soon. These months had been tough since I lost my previous job due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Working as a delivery driver for a pizza shop wasn't my ideal choice in my late 20s, but my options were limited, and this was the only place willing to hire me. In the beginning, there weren't many orders, but over time, requests surged significantly. With all restaurants closing, everyone preferred to stay home, leading us to work long hours. It was just another day on the job when I received a call around midnight for 4 large pizzas from a house located about 30 minutes outside of town. I accepted the order eagerly, knowing it would be my last of the night, and that a big order meant a decent tip. As I set out, the roads were completely empty. There was no one outside due to the lockdowns. However, as I drove, I began to sense something was off with my car. I tried to ignore it, but the vehicle struggled more and more as I went along. Upon arriving at the address, I was immediately confused. There was a long driveway with an open gate that looked like it led to a mansion. But at the end of the driveway was just a dead end surrounded by forest. Not far into the trees, I spotted a glowing light. Curious, I pulled in and parked in the middle of the driveway. Now, standing outside, I realized it was a campfire or bonfire, and I could hear a group of people talking. Moments later, a figure stepped in front of the light, waving at me as if inviting me to bring over the pizzas. It goes without saying that this was not a normal situation, but seeing them wave and hearing their chatter made me think they were just a bunch of college kids hanging out. After all, they had ordered 4 large pizzas, so it seemed reasonable in my mind. I retrieved the pizzas from the back seat, leaving my headlights on as I walked off the driveway and toward the trees. As I approached the bonfire, more people began to appear, all watching me as I moved closer. When I reached the gathering, I counted about 6 more people standing and sitting around the fire. Strangely, none of them seemed pleased that the pizzas had arrived. There were no drinks or music, nothing to indicate a party atmosphere, just a group of people standing around a fire. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I stood at the edge of the site, awkwardly holding the pizzas, hoping someone would come forward to take them. Just then, a man walked over, took the boxes from me, and handed them to someone else. The eerie vibe of this place was getting to me, making me more uncomfortable with every passing second. Before I could even ask for payment, I heard footsteps approaching from the forest. Several more people emerged, increasing the group to at least 12, all staring at me in silence. I had never left without being paid before, but the situation made me tremble. I quickly turned around and started walking back to my car, glancing over my shoulder to see them still standing by the fire, not uttering a word. As I exited the tree line, my heart nearly stopped when 2 figures sprinted away from behind my car and dashed into the forest, disappearing beyond the headlights. I didn't even check if anything was missing. I jumped into my car, reversed, and sped down the road, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. Once I returned to the shop, I recounted the bizarre situation to my manager. Thankfully, he believed me and even tried to call the number used for the order, but there was no answer. After some discussion, I felt compelled to report the suspicious behavior to the police. It had been less than an hour since my encounter, but when the police arrived, the only sign of the group was the bonfire still burning, unattended. What truly happened that night remains a mystery. As far as I could see, it was likely to stay that way. In my 20s, I started working as an overnight lead at a local retail store. It wasn't one of those well-known big chain stores. It was a small place with only about 8 or 9 locations. Most nights, I would have an overnight stalker to assist me, but it wasn't uncommon for me to spend the entire shift alone. The store was not large, so the working environment wasn't particularly intense. Often, I would find myself working slowly just to avoid running out of things to do. That night was one of those quiet nights where I found myself alone. I started my shift by loading up some boxes and moving into the aisles to begin stocking the shelves. It didn't require much mental effort, so my mind wandered to random thoughts, and I wasn't really paying attention. I made my way through about 3 aisles when a knock at the front entrance startled me. It took me a moment to realize what it was because I was so spaced out. But once I did, confusion washed over me. The knocking happened again, loud enough to echo through the store. I walked to the end of the aisle and looked through the large front windows, seeing a man in a hood standing at the door. I approached the glass and said, "We're closed. We won't be open until 8 a.m. The man looked at me but didn't respond. I pointed to the sign on the door, repeating, "We're closed, sorry." The man continued to stare at me for a few seconds before turning and walking away. I watched him as he walked until he disappeared from sight. It didn't seem like he had parked anywhere, and the whole situation was odd, to say the least. I figured he was just at the wrong place or something. I returned to my task of stocking the shelves, eventually forgetting about the man. By 2 a.m., I had made it through half of the aisles and was ready to take my lunch break. I left the boxes where they were and headed to the break room at the other end of the building. I spent about half an hour in there, enjoying a moment of quiet. The room was dim, and I didn't hear any sounds, which added to my sense of isolation. After finishing my lunch, I tossed the leftovers and returned to work. As I walked through the store toward the aisle I was working on, I suddenly saw a man walking past at the other end. He looked like he was just passing through the store, unaware of my presence. I froze in place, feeling a rush of fear. Listening intently, I could hear his footsteps moving toward the side of the building I had just come from. I quickly ducked into an aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they were heading toward the break room, but just before I left the aisle to get help, I heard the man rushing out of the room. His footsteps were now sprinting through the store, getting closer and closer. I bolted for the other end of the aisle, glancing back to see the man turning into my path and running toward me. I raced toward the front door, fumbling with my keys and trying to unlock it with shaking hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I managed to open the door. As I stepped out of the building, I caught a bright flash in the corner of my eye, followed by a loud pop that made my ears ring. A gunshot. I had no idea where it landed, but I sprinted for my life around the building. Reaching my car, I dove into the back seat and called 911, my heart pounding in my chest. From what I gathered, the man didn't follow me outside. He was gone by the time the police arrived. They found the back door of the store had been forced open, with some heavy tools lying next to it. The most chilling discovery was the bullet hole beside the front doors. Why the man broke in and targeted me remains unknown. From his behavior, the police believed he might have been experiencing a mental breakdown or a psychotic episode, with no real reason to specifically target me other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer worked there after that incident, but I can tell you that for the years following, I was always on edge every single night, haunted by the memory of that terrifying moment. That incident became a marker in my memory, renewing my sense of anxiety whenever I found myself alone anywhere, especially at night. I made sure to check every corner and shadow, trying to avoid any situation that felt off. It taught me a harsh lesson about the darkness that night can hold, and how tranquility can sometimes mask something far more sinister. I worked from home for a cybersecurity company, which might not sound as interesting as some would imagine. My shift started at 10 p.m. and lasted until 6 a.m., during which I would sift through files full of code, looking for potential threats. Those nights were extremely dull, and coupled with the overnight hours, it was always a struggle to stay awake. One night, just a few weeks ago, I was working at 2 a.m., feeling the heaviness of my eyelids. I pushed through the sleepiness for a while, checking my phone repeatedly, hoping that time had somehow skipped forward. When the clock struck 2:40, I decided to take a break and order some food to fuel myself for the remaining 3 hours of my shift. My only real option for delivery was Taco Bell, so I placed an order and went to grab something to drink. As I moved through the house, I noticed the heavy rain outside, and I felt a twinge of guilt for making someone brave the downpour for my convenience. After about 10 minutes, I was notified that my order had been picked up, so I sat on the couch, waiting for them to arrive. However, after another 5 minutes, I started to feel anxious. I watched the map on Uber Eats as the car approached my neighborhood. They were just around the corner, but when I looked outside, I didn't see any headlights. I began to worry they might have the wrong address, so I tried calling them, but my call was rejected. After a few more minutes of waiting, I tried again. This time, the call connected, but all I could hear was the sound of rain pouring down. I hung up, feeling uneasy about the whole situation. Checking the map again, I saw that they were still right outside my house, but I felt a growing dread, knowing they were wandering in the rain without any sign of them. I locked the door and barely took a few steps down the hallway before I heard a loud knock that made my heart race. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man in a gray hoodie pacing on the porch, his head darting around as if checking for anyone watching him. He yelled, "Uber Eats delivery," but I couldn't see a bag of food anywhere. I remained silent, not wanting to give away my presence. The man became increasingly frantic, calling out several more times. Suddenly, he pressed himself against the door, blocking my view, and I heard a few dull scrapes against the wood. Then he quickly darted to the side of the house and vanished into the rain. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They informed me that he had been using a scam account. A couple of days passed without any incidents until I noticed a small scratch on my front door. It was an X shape, but didn't appear to be meant for me to see. It looked more like a hidden personal indicator. While it could have been a random scratch, I painted over it to conceal whatever message it might have signified. That night still lingers in my mind, leaving me with a sense of unease, especially since the man had some sort of sharp object in his hand as he waited for me to open the door. Part of me remains convinced that this won't be my last encounter with him. In my mid-20s, I worked as an overnight manager at a small retail store, which wasn't a big place, with only a handful of branches. I considered myself lucky to have this job, especially since I was the only employee during the night, making me responsible for checking stock, restocking shelves, and sometimes receiving shipments. I had never encountered any issues at work, and my nights usually went smoothly. However, there was something lurking on the horizon, something I hadn't yet realized. One night, as I began my shift, the weather started to change. Strong winds picked up and heavy rain fell, causing sounds to echo throughout the store. That night reminded me of old stories about times we would gather around the fireplace, listening to the thunder outside and sharing tales. But this time, I was alone, with only the sound of the rain and the wind battering the store walls. After 2 hours of working, while I was busy restocking, I heard it. It was a strange sound, like a thud resonating through the store. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to check the source of the noise. I walked over to the shipping area where the large metal door was used by truck drivers for deliveries. But when I opened the door, I was met with the cold rain and wind hitting my face. I looked outside, but there were no trucks, just darkness and rain. I returned to my work, convinced that the sound was just the building shifting from the wind, or perhaps some odd thunder I hadn't noticed before. I continued for another hour before taking a lunch break in the back office, spending about 15 minutes there. However, as I walked through the store afterward, I got this strange feeling that everything had fallen silent, except for the rain tapping on the roof. It sent chills down my spine, and when I reached the end of the aisle, I saw something that made my heart almost stop. A line of wet shoe prints trailing halfway down the aisle. Without thinking, I approached the prints, trying to comprehend how they could be there. I followed them to the front of the store, only to find a myriad of watery prints scattered around, making it impossible to track their origin, and honestly horrifying to realize that someone had walked around the entire place. I dashed back to the office, locked myself inside, and called the police, feeling increasingly scared as I couldn't see outside the office door. And the pouring rain drowned out any other sounds. After 10 minutes, the operator who had me on hold came back on the line and said the police were right outside the building. I quickly got up, opened the door, and found another set of wet shoe prints on the ground, leading right up to my office. I sprinted to the front and hurried to let the police in. They searched the store but found no one. Soon after, they reviewed the security tapes, revealing a man in a dark jacket entering the building through a side door that had been left unlocked. He clearly spotted me early on and remained hidden until I went on break. Then, he aimlessly wandered the aisles, not stealing or breaking anything, just looking at the shelves. The creepiest part was when I was in the office, waiting for the police. The man stood outside the office door, staring at the doorknob as if he was preparing for me to come out. Fortunately, he walked away a few minutes later and exited the store. No further footage of him was seen after that. The man never returned, and as far as I know, he was never found. What he was doing that night remains uncertain, and it will likely linger as an eerie mystery for the rest of my life. Last fall, as the season drew to a close and winter approached, the air became decidedly colder where I live, often accompanied by the first snows of October. I had been working in food delivery for the past 3 years, and one particular night, around 10 p.m., the first snowfall began to lightly blanket the ground. It was a quiet night, and with the snow falling gently, people seemed skittish about going out. I found myself among the few cars navigating the streets, yet orders continued to roll in, one right after the other. After driving around delivering food until nearly 1 a.m., I accepted one final order. The snowfall was intensifying, and fatigue was beginning to set in. I made my way to the McDonald's, where the food had been ordered, and picked it up before entering the address into my GPS. The destination was only about 10 minutes away, but I hadn't considered its location before accepting the order. It was in the opposite direction from my home, which was already a good 25 minutes away, meaning my drive back would be long. Annoyed with myself, I turned out of the parking lot and onto the road. The snowplows hadn't yet come out. Perhaps they hadn't anticipated such a heavy snowfall. My SUV usually handled snow well, so I didn't feel too anxious as I drove. However, I quickly realized I was leaving the main area of town. I checked the map again, confirming that I was still headed the right way, but it felt like an unusual route. I didn't even know there were houses in this area, as most people use this road to reach the highway leading out of the state. After a few minutes of driving, I encountered a turnoff, a small street branching off from the main road. I slowed down, exercising caution since this road was narrower and flanked by trees. I was acutely aware that sliding off would make for a terrible night. As I made my way down the street, I spotted a few long driveways leading to faint lights flickering in the trees ahead. I navigated slowly through the last driveway, which looked similar to the others, until I finally arrived at the house. It was a medium-sized, older structure, entirely blanketed in snow. Nothing about it stood out, aside from its location in the middle of the woods. I parked out front, grabbed the food bag, and trudged through the thick snow that soaked my shoes and the lower legs of my pants. When I reached the porch, I knocked and began to set the bag down. Almost immediately, the door swung open. I looked up to see a large man in a winter jacket. His face was pale, as though he had been outside for a while. "Hi, I've got your order right here," I said, holding up the bag. After a moment, the man stepped back, opening the door wider. "You can set it down right over there." He gestured towards what I assumed was the kitchen. The way he said it made me feel as though I had to comply, but I knew it was a terrible idea to go inside. I glanced at his hands and saw he wasn't holding anything, which made it clear that handing him the bag was the only sensible action. "Sorry, but I really have to get going," I said nervously, raising the bag again. The man's expression shifted into a frown, and then he abruptly slammed the door shut. Shocked by the sudden change in his demeanor, I set the bag down on the porch and quickly began walking back to my car. Just as I passed through the front yard, I heard a sound behind me. I turned to realize it was coming from the other side of the house, maybe a back door or something similar, but the noise was too muffled to discern clearly. Feeling increasingly creeped out, I quickened my pace and climbed into my car. I started the engine, and when I looked up, I saw the man emerging from the side of his house, quickly heading toward my vehicle. He had something in his hands that almost looked like rope, but there was something else that I couldn't quite make out. My heart raced, and adrenaline surged through my body as I began to back out of the driveway. I was desperate to leave quickly without getting stuck in the snow. The man closed the distance, only a few feet away when I finally gained traction and started to accelerate. I backed through the entire driveway, watching as he stopped and observed me, slowly fading into the darkness as I backed out onto the street. What had just transpired was utterly terrifying and confusing enough that I didn't want to dwell on it. I continue to do food deliveries, but I'm far more cautious now. Most of the time, I don't even knock on doors anymore. I just drop the food on the porch and leave. Had I stayed any longer that night, or entered the house, Who knows what might have happened to me? The experience lingers in my mind, reminding me to always be on guard in this unpredictable world I navigate daily. It was an ordinary day at a 24-hour drive-through restaurant where I worked as a crew manager. Even though I held a managerial position, most of my daily tasks involved cooking and taking orders like any other employee. That night, I was preparing for my shift during the overnight hours, and we typically had at least 2 people working. However, fate had other plans. When the cook called in sick, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. I reached out to a few colleagues to see if anyone could cover the shift, but everyone declined. By midnight, I found myself alone in the restaurant. Usually, there isn't much traffic during these hours, and more staff members would arrive at 4 a.m., so I figured I could handle the situation. Still, I knew I would have to manage everything by myself for 4 long hours. I put on my headset, hoping someone would place an order in the drive-thru, and started cleaning the stovetops. I was busy with my tasks when suddenly I heard loud banging sounds coming from the front of the restaurant. Curious, I walked down to the counter and looked through the glass. A man stood at the front door, banging on it. He pressed his face against the glass, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto mine. As I approached the door, he stepped back slightly, as if waiting for me to open it. I shouted through the glass that our dining area was closed and that he needed to use the drive-thru if he wanted to place an order. He looked confused, so I yelled again, informing him that the doors were locked and he had to use the drive-thru. This time, he showed no response, leaving me uncertain whether he understood me. I turned around and walked back to the kitchen, hoping he would eventually grasp that he couldn't enter. I spent another 15 to 20 minutes working on the stovetops. A while later, I decided to check the front again, and to my relief, the man was gone. The parking lot was empty, and he was no longer at the door. Just as I finished with the stoves, I received an alert through my headset indicating that someone was in the drive-thru. I turned on my mic and asked for their order while walking to the window, but no one responded. When I reached the window, I immediately noticed on the camera that there was no car outside. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of movement either. I shrugged it off and started to head back. However, as I was returning to the back room, I suddenly paused, thinking I heard something unusual. I stood still, straining to listen, and that's when I heard footsteps slowly walking above me on the roof. They were cautious steps, barely making a sound except for the creaking of the roof. I had no doubt someone was up there. I followed the sound of their steps with my gaze, moving along the ceiling until I spotted the ladder leading to the maintenance hatch. In that moment, the realization hit me. I sprinted over to the ladder, searching for a lock to secure the hatch, but I had never even used it before, so I had no idea how it worked or if it even locked. Then came a loud creak from the ceiling directly above me, followed by a few thuds outside the hatch. A moment later, the hatch creaked open slightly, and through the small gap, I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. In a panic, I dashed toward the front of the building, hearing loud thuds from above as I quickly unlocked the door and ran for my car. I called the police as I sat inside, frantically scanning the windows of the restaurant. That's when I noticed a shadow moving near the front counter, and suddenly, a man appeared, standing at the far end of the restaurant, looking in my direction. After a moment, he turned and disappeared behind the kitchen, leaving me in a state of panic until the police arrived. When they got there, they searched inside and outside, even going up to the roof, but the man had already escaped. Nothing was missing from the restaurant. No equipment, no money. Nothing. He had just broken in and left, which was even more unsettling. I tried not to dwell on it too much, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was there for me. Even with his face captured on the security cameras, the police had yet to confirm his identity. The owner of the building had since added a padlock to the hatch, which should have been done long ago. Still, I worried about the man's intentions and whether he might be watching for another opportunity to confront me. That night left an indelible mark on my mind. A chilling reminder of how quickly things could turn terrifying. On a weekend night, I was working on deliveries through DoorDash, which I chose as a way to earn a little extra cash. I started driving around 9 p.m., picking up orders steadily until about 11 p.m., when things began to slow down a bit. During that time, I was just driving around the shopping center that housed most of the fast food restaurants people often ordered from. After a while, another order came through. It was a regular order for delivery about 4 miles away. After picking up the food, I started the directions to the address. However, I quickly felt something strange. The address didn't seem like a house. I zoomed in on the map and saw only streets and buildings, but the address was on a street with no buildings on it. It looked like an empty plot of land. Still, I didn't have much choice but to head that way, knowing that the DoorDash map isn't always accurate. I drove for just under 20 minutes until I reached the street it was on. It was completely bare, with no houses, crossroads, or cars. When I got to the end, the road turned to gravel, and there was a small wooden sign that was too weathered to be legible. I pulled onto the gravel road and turned on my brights. Right away, I could see something far down the road. As I drove in closer, my phone dinged to let me know I had arrived. In my headlights was a small mobile home or some kind of RV, and on the door were poorly painted numbers. I looked back at my phone, 2760. I hesitated for a moment, but then I held the food in my hand and walked up to the RV. As I got closer, I felt a growing sense of unease. The RV was old and overgrown, which was strange considering it was meant to be mobile. I knocked on the door and waited. I knew this was a rare cash order, which made sense once I saw the place, but it definitely didn't make me feel good standing there. An eerie feeling loomed over me. The RV was surrounded by woods, and there were no lights anywhere past it. Just complete darkness. I heard something from inside and prepared myself for someone to open the door, but then a voice startled me from my right. I turned and saw a man smiling at me, standing by the corner of the RV. He asked if I had his order, and I nodded, apologizing as I walked it over to him. I handed it off and said, "Is that the total?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, then smiled again and said he just needed to grab the rest. He turned and walked back around the RV while I stayed where I was. This whole interaction, while simple, felt very off in person. There was just something about the way he acted and spoke that gave me chills. I waited for a minute or so before growing more anxious and looking around the corner to see where he went. In the distance, I saw a figure standing next to what looked like the dark outline of a shed. They weren't moving. They were just standing there. As fear began to rise within me, I suddenly heard the door to the RV opening. A different man looked out at me, and just as I started to greet him, he slammed the door shut. My heartbeat quickened. I looked back at the man by the shed, who was now walking back toward the RV, holding something in his hands. In that moment, I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it looked like either a long bat or a rifle. I sprinted back to my car, got inside, and turned it on with shaky hands. As I put it in reverse, the man came around the side of the RV and stood calmly in the darkness while I drove off. I had no idea what was happening, but I wasn't keen on finding out. I went straight home and debated calling 911, but I was caught up in confusion over what had transpired. In the end, I made the regrettable decision not to notify the police, and whatever happened that night would remain just a strange encounter with no answers to its true nature. I remembered another odd incident from my early days of working deliveries. I was driving through my city, delivering for Postmates when it had just started out. Most orders were within the main city blocks, but one day I got an order from outside the main roads. I picked up the food and headed out, but the further I got from the city, the less populated the roads became, both in terms of cars and houses. Everything was replaced by woods. I had been out this way before, but only when leaving town. I didn't even know there were houses out here. I drove until the GPS told me to turn down a gravel road that was nearly unnoticeable. There were no lights except for the dim ones coming from my old car as I made my way down this narrow path through the woods. It was much longer than I expected, taking a whole minute to reach the house. To be honest, it looked exactly as I assumed it would due to its isolated location in the woods. It was aged and almost entirely made of wood, with vines growing up the outside. There were a few lights on inside shining through the windows, but if there hadn't been, I probably would have thought twice about approaching it. I checked the back for anything suspicious and then went up to the front door. I pressed the doorbell, which didn't really work, so I had to knock as well. As soon as my hand hit the door, it creaked open cautiously. I opened it a little further and called out, "I have an order here from Postmates." A moment later, I called out again, "Is anyone home?" There were no sounds coming from inside, but all the lights I could see were on, and through the crack in the doorway, I could see a TV in the living room. It was playing, but muted. I don't know how else to explain it, but the vibes were just off, and I knew something was wrong. I turned and went back to my car, getting in and immediately starting to do a U-turn. But I felt a problem. The steering was stiff, and my car was struggling to move through the gravel, feeling extremely bumpy and jittery. I got out and felt my heart drop when I saw that my front tire was flat. Then I looked over at the other tires, and every single one of them was flat too. Not just a little deflated, but completely flattened. In that moment, my stomach dropped. Knowing this was a purposeful act, my mind raced with possibilities. What terrified me was that I didn't know whether someone had put something in the path or if someone had come up while I was at the house and done it behind my back. Either way, the only thing I knew was that someone was out there with me, way out in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. I got back inside my car and locked the doors, trying to call 911 but having no connection. As I ran through my few options, I saw a light in the house flicker, and the front door opened wider, revealing a man in the doorway. Without hesitation, he started walking quickly over to my car. This time, I didn't second-guess myself. I put it in drive and forced my car through the gravel. In the mirror, I saw the man stop and stare at my car. Once I was on the main road, I drove more carefully, going slow to avoid damaging my car until I got enough signal to call 911. What unfolded afterwards was equally terrifying. The house was owned by a single mother with 2 kids, all of whom said they were at home sleeping in their rooms at the time I claimed this happened. They never ordered anything, didn't see any man, and didn't find anything missing in their home. I don't know if they were in on it somehow or if they were just as much victims as I was. Why the man ordered food to the house and slashed my tires still doesn't make sense to me. The only thought I could muster was that maybe he was planning something horrible against that family, and I was going to be set up to take the fall for it due to my presence at the property at the exact time it would have been committed. It may sound far-fetched, but if that's true, then my getting away might have saved more lives than just my own. Days passed, but those experiences still lingered in my mind, reminding me that I live in a world where mystery and danger can lurk around every corner.